Welcome to Boston. The year is 1720. Take a deep breath and fill your lungs with the cold Atlantic air. Can you smell that? It is a heavy mix of salt water, drying fish, pine tar, and wood smoke. We are standing on the edge of the world, or at least it feels that way to the people who live here. If you look around, you might be surprised by how small everything seems. This is not the sprawling metropolis you know from the 21st century. In fact, we are standing on a small, pear-shaped peninsula called Chalmot, barely connected to the mainland by a thin strip of land that disappears when the tide gets too high. You are surrounded by water on almost every side, trapped in a town that feels like a little piece of old England dropped onto a rugged, untamed shore. There are about 12,000 souls living here right now, packed into wooden houses along crooked, muddy lanes. But do not let this quiet colonial atmosphere fool you for a second. Underneath these cobblestones and behind these brick facades, a fire is waiting to be lit. You have just landed in the most dangerous city in the British Empire, though nobody knows it yet. This is where the spark of a revolution will eventually catch. But for now, the residents are worried about something much more immediate than independence. To understand this place, you must first look up toward the horizon. The skyline of 1720 is dominated not by glass towers, but by three massive peaks that loom over the town. The locals call this the Trimount, or Tremont, a rugged range of three hills that defines the geography of the peninsula. Beacon Hill is the tallest of them, standing high and wild, with a warning beacon perched at its very top to alert the countryside of danger. The city huddles in the shadow of these hills, clinging to the waterfront where all the money is made. It is a place of deep contradictions. While the wharves are busy with sailors and merchants shouting over crates of goods, the heart of the town beats to a much stricter rhythm. This was founded as a city upon a hill, a religious experiment led by Puritans who believed they were doing God's work. Life here is governed by an intense moral code that might feel suffocating to a modern visitor. If you walk these streets on a Sunday, you will hear absolutely nothing. No carts are allowed to move, no shops are open, and simply walking too fast or laughing too loud could earn you a fine or a spot in the stocks. The church bells govern the day, and the eyes of your neighbors are always watching. But in the year 1721, the silence of the Sabbath was broken by a terrified whisper that traveled from door to door. It started when the ship HMS Seahorse arrived from the West Indies, carrying a crew member with the telltale signs of a devastating illness. It was the smallpox, and in a crowded town like Boston, it was a sentence of doom. Panic spread faster than the infection itself. Flags were raised to warn travelers, and families barricaded themselves inside their homes, praying the sickness would pass over their doorsteps. But in the middle of this tragedy, an unlikely hero emerged from the pulpit. The Reverend Cotton Mather, a man usually known for his rigid religious views and his role in the witch trials decades earlier, began advocating for something radical. He had learned from an enslaved man named Onesimus about a procedure used in Africa to prevent the sickness. It was an early form of inoculation. The town was furious. People threw stones through Mather's windows, believing he was interfering with divine will. It was a clash between old fears and new science. By the time the crisis faded, nearly half the population had fallen ill, and over 800 residents were lost forever. The city that emerged from that winter was scarred and grieving, but it was also tougher, smarter, and ready to rebuild. If you jump forward 2 decades to 1742, the silence of the sick wards has been replaced by the roar of commerce. Boston has transformed itself into the undisputed economic engine of the colonies, and nowhere is this clearer than at the Long Wharf. This is not just a dock. It is a marvel of engineering that stretches nearly 2,000 feet out into the harbor, acting like a main street built directly upon the ocean. Walking down this wooden spine, you are surrounded by a chaotic symphony of seagulls, creaking ropes, and the shouts of dockhands rolling barrels of molasses and rum. The air here is thick with the scent of spices from the Caribbean, tea from London, and the ever-present smell of salted cod, which they call sacred cod because it brings so much gold into the city. Boston has become the unofficial capital of British North America, a place where a man with the right connections and a fast ship can make a fortune overnight in the triangular trade routes that crisscross the Atlantic. At the center of this golden age stands a brand new structure that signals Boston has arrived as a world-class city. It is called Faneuil Hall, a gift to the town from Peter Faneuil, who is perhaps the wealthiest merchant in the colony. Before this, merchants argued over prices in the open streets, exposed to the rain and snow. But now they have a majestic brick headquarters topped with a golden grasshopper weather vane that glints in the sun. The building is a symbol of the new order. The ground floor is a bustling marketplace for butchers and farmers, while the floor above is a refined meeting hall for town politics. It is a physical representation of how commerce and governance are fused together in the Bostonian soul. The wooden shacks of the early settlement are slowly disappearing, replaced by sturdy Georgian brick mansions that line the winding streets of the North End, announcing to the world that this city is built to last. However, this prosperity has created a city of two very different faces. While the merchant elite strut down King Street in imported velvet coats, powdered wigs, and silk stockings, the majority of the population is still scraping by in rough-spun wool. You can see the divide clearly in the taverns and on the wharves. The wealthy families like the Hutchinsons and the Hancocks live like British aristocrats, drinking fine Madeira wine and toasting to the king's health, seemingly unaware of the resentment building in the muddy alleyways below them. The dock workers, the rope makers, and the sailors are the muscles that keep this machine moving, but they are finding it harder to afford bread in a city where prices are rising as fast as the church steeples. It is a time of incredible wealth, but it is a brittle kind of success, dependent on an empire that is beginning to pay very close attention to just how rich its rebellious children are becoming. The golden era of easy money did not last forever, and by 1765, the bill for the empire's expensive wars had finally come due. The atmosphere in Boston shifted violently from ambition to resentment as the British Parliament began imposing direct taxes on the colonies to pay off their debts. The most hated of these was the Stamp Act, which required a royal stamp on almost every piece of paper, from legal documents to playing cards. Suddenly, the busy streets described earlier were filled not with commerce, but with angry protests. You could feel the temperature of the city rising, fueled by a group of locals calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, who met under the branches of a great elm tree known as the Liberty Tree. They organized boycotts and hung effigies of tax collectors, turning the once loyal capital into a hotbed of defiance. The Crown responded not with negotiation, but with force, sending thousands of soldiers to restore order. By 1768, Boston was an occupied city, with one redcoat soldier for every 4 citizens, and the constant presence of these armed men on every corner turned the town into a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark finally ignited on a freezing night, March 5, 1770. The tension that had been simmering for months boiled over on King Street, right in front of the Customs House. It started as a small argument between a lone British sentry and a few local apprentices, but it quickly escalated into a chaotic scene. Church bells began to ring, which usually signaled a fire, drawing a crowd of hundreds into the snowy street. The locals, frustrated and angry, began throwing snowballs, chunks of ice, and oyster shells at the soldiers, daring them to fire. In the confusion and the darkness, with shouting coming from all sides, the soldiers raised their muskets. To this day, it is debated whether an order was actually given, but the result was a sudden, deafening volley of shots that echoed against the brick buildings. When the smoke cleared, the snow was stained, and 5 colonists lay on the ground, having lost their lives in the confrontation. This tragic event, which the locals would later call a massacre to rally support for their cause, was the point of no return. Among the victims was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, who became one of the first to fall for the cause of American liberty. The soldiers were put on trial, defended by none other than John Adams, a local lawyer who believed in the rule of law even for the hated troops. While the legal proceedings calmed the streets temporarily, the psychological damage was done. The image of British soldiers firing upon their own citizens was etched into the public mind, thanks to a famous and highly sensationalized engraving by a silversmith named Paul Revere. The incident on King Street proved that the relationship between Boston and London was broken beyond repair, and although an uneasy peace followed, everyone knew it was just the calm before a much larger storm. The uneasy peace that followed the tragedy on King Street shattered completely over a simple beverage that symbolized British control: tea. By 1773, the Parliament had granted a monopoly to the East India Company, undercutting local merchants and asserting their right to tax the colonies at will. The response from Boston was calculated and dramatic. On the cold night of December 16, 1773, thousands of people gathered at the Old South Meeting House before a select group of men, some disguised as Mohawk warriors to hide their identities, marched down to Griffin's Wharf. In a disciplined operation that lasted for hours, they boarded 3 ships and smashed open 342 chests of tea, dumping nearly 90,000 pounds of the valuable leaf into the freezing dark waters of the harbor. It was not a riot, but a precise political statement, performed in eerie silence so that the only sound heard was the cracking of wood and the splash of crates hitting the water. The reaction from London was swift and punishing. The British government decided to make an example of the rebellious town by passing what became known as the Intolerable Acts, effectively closing the port of Boston to all commerce until the tea was paid for. For a city that lived and died by the sea, this was a death sentence. The once noisy wharves fell silent, ships sat rotting at their docks, and grass literally began to grow in the cracks of the cobblestones on the busiest commercial streets. Boston was no longer just an occupied city. It was now a prison, cut off from the world and surrounded by the Royal Navy. Unemployment skyrocketed, and the residents had to rely on donations of food smuggled in from other colonies just to survive the winter. The atmosphere was heavy with paranoia, as spies were everywhere, and every conversation in a tavern could lead to arrest. By the spring of 1775, the city was a fortress, holding 4,000 British soldiers who were just as miserable and anxious as the locals. General Thomas Gage, the military governor, knew that the colonists were stockpiling supplies in the countryside, and he formulated a plan to seize them. On the night of April 18th, the tension finally snapped. 2 lanterns were hung in the steeple of the Old North Church to signal that the troops were moving by sea, crossing the Charles River to march on the towns of Lexington and Concord. The next morning, the first shots of the revolution were fired, though nobody knows who pulled the trigger first. When the exhausted British troops retreated back to Boston later that day, they found themselves trapped. A massive makeshift army of 20,000 angry colonists had surrounded the landward side of the peninsula. The city of Boston was now under siege, the epicenter of a conflict that would change the map of the world forever. The stalemate of the siege finally broke in March of 1776, thanks to a daring move that stunned the British command. Under the cover of darkness, the colonial army miraculously positioned heavy cannons atop Dorchester Heights, aiming them directly at the British fleet anchored in the harbor below. When the sun rose on March 17th, the British commanders realized their position was indefensible, and they had no choice but to retreat. It was a sight that the people of Boston had prayed for. Over 100 ships raised their sails and vanished over the horizon, taking the military occupation with them. For the first time in years, the city belonged to its people again. Just a few months later, in July, the citizens gathered below the balcony of the old State House to hear the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. The lion and unicorn statues, symbols of royal authority, were pulled down from the roof and burned in a bonfire, marking the end of the colonial era and the beginning of a new American chapter. But the revolution did not just change the government. It physically reshaped the earth itself. In the decades that followed, the ambitious residents decided that their small peninsula was too cramped for their big dreams. They literally cut down the tops of the three great hills, the Tri-Mount that had defined the skyline for a century, and used that earth to fill in the surrounding coves and marshes. The narrow neck of land was widened, and the shoreline was pushed outward, creating the land where entire neighborhoods like the Back Bay sit today. If you walk the Freedom Trail now, you are stepping on history that runs deep beneath the pavement. The wooden wharves and muddy lanes are gone, replaced by glass and steel, but the spirit of that stubborn, intellectual, and rebellious town remains. That tiny, pear-shaped piece of land, once home to just 12,000 souls, proved that even the smallest place can spark a fire bright enough to change the entire world.